On the morning of April 5, 1945, a 25-year-old lieutenant crawled up a mountain in northern Italy toward a German fortress called Castle Aghinolfi. Before that day ended, he had personally destroyed 3 machine gun nests, an observation post, and a dugout, accounted for 9 enemy dead, and led the survivors of his shattered platoon back down through the minefields. The army gave him the Distinguished Service Cross. It did not give him the Medal of Honor, and everyone involved understood exactly why. He would wait 52 years for it. His name was Vernon Baker. Here is the number that frames this whole story. 1.2 million Black Americans served in the armed forces of the United States in the Second World War. They fought in Italy and France, in the Pacific, and in the air over Europe. And when the war ended and the honors were counted, the number of medals of honor awarded to black servicemen was 0, not 1. In a war that produced 464 of them, not a single one went to a black American. The reason was not a shortage of courage. It was the paperwork of a segregated army. The president who presided over that omission, who stood in the White House in 1945 and hung those medals around the necks of American heroes, was Harry Truman. And the president who, 3 years later, signed the executive order that finally tore segregation out of the United States military, was also Harry Truman. Both of those things are true, and Vernon Baker lived on both sides of them. To understand what that cost him and what it never took from him, start with an orphan in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and a recruiting sergeant who told him the army had no place for people like him. Vernon Joseph Baker was born in Cheyenne, Wyoming, in December 1919, and by the age of 4 he was an orphan, both parents killed in an automobile accident. He was raised by his grandparents, and his grandfather, a railroad man, taught him the 2 things that would define his war: how to shoot out in the Wyoming country and how to carry himself without asking anyone's permission. He was small, quiet, and stubborn. When the war came, he went to enlist, and the recruiting sergeant looked at him and said the army had no quotas for people like him. Baker went away. Then he came back, and he got in. That stubbornness carried him further than the army expected. He went to officer candidate school and was commissioned a 2nd lieutenant on the 11th of January 1943 and was assigned to the 370th Regiment of the 92nd Infantry Division. The 92nd were the Buffalo Soldiers, the only black infantry division to fight in Europe in that war, an entire division of black enlisted men, led in large part by white officers, sent to Italy carrying a burden no white unit carried: the constant unspoken suspicion that they would not fight. They understand what that meant day to day. They trained under commanders who had already decided what they were worth. Their failures were reported upward and their successes were not. Reputations were assigned to them before a shot was fired, and into that atmosphere came a small, quiet lieutenant from Wyoming, leading a weapons platoon who had absolutely no intention of proving anybody's theory. Baker later put his whole philosophy into a single plain sentence that says more than any speech. "I was a soldier," he said, "and I had a job to do." In April of 1945, the job came for him. What he did on that mountain is documented in detail, and it is remarkable enough on its own. But the part of this story that still stings 70 years on is not the mountain. It is what happened at the desk afterward, when the recommendation went up the chain and came back down as something smaller. And it is what Baker did with that, which was not to quit, not to grow bitter in public, and not to leave. He stayed in the United States Army for another 23 years. Hold that fact as we go up the hill with him. By the spring of 1945, the German line across northern Italy, the Gothic Line, had been the hardest ground in the Western War for 8 months, a belt of fortified mountains stretching coast to coast, dug in and interlocked and paid for in tens of thousands of Allied casualties. The 92nd was pushing at its western end near the coast above Viareggio, and sitting on high ground above them was Castle Aghinolfi, an old stone fortress the Germans had turned into a strong point, bristling with machine guns, mortars, and observation over every approach. Before dawn on April 5th, Baker's company moved up toward the castle. He was out front with his weapons platoon, and he did what good lieutenants do, which is see the ground first. What he found were German positions the maps had not shown, camouflaged and waiting, covering the ground his men would have to cross. He began, methodically, to take them apart. He crawled to a machine gun nest and destroyed it and its crew. He found a hidden observation post and killed the 2 men inside it. He blew open a dugout with a grenade and shot the occupants as they came out. Then it got worse. German mortars and machine guns opened on the exposed company from the fortress above, and men began to fall fast. Baker kept moving, kept firing, kept knocking out positions, a second machine gun nest, then a third, working alone across ground where standing up was fatal. By the official reckoning of that morning, 1 lieutenant had destroyed 3 machine gun nests, an observation post, and a dugout, and accounted for 9 enemy dead. The action had cost company terribly. And then his commanding officer made a decision that has never stopped being discussed. The white captain commanding the company told Baker he was going back for reinforcements. He left. He did not return. Whatever the reason, and men have argued about it ever since, the result was that a badly cut-up unit was left on an exposed hillside under the guns of a fortress, and the senior man remaining was Lieutenant Vernon Baker. So he did the job. He covered the withdrawal himself, and he brought the survivors of his platoon back down and out through the minefields, and then, the following night, he volunteered to lead a battalion attack back through the same ground. The army was not blind. What Baker had done was too plain to ignore, and he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest decoration for valor, pinned on him in 1945. It was a real honor, and he wore it with pride his whole life. But everyone in that chain of command knew what a white lieutenant with the same afternoon's work would have received, and it was not the second highest decoration. The recommendation that should have gone up for the Medal of Honor either was never written or never survived the journey. Meanwhile, in Washington, in the late months of 1945, President Harry Truman stood in the White House and personally presented the Medal of Honor to American soldiers, sailors, and Marines. Not one of them was black, and yet it was that same plain-spoken Missouri farmer who had grown up in a segregated world, and whose own grandparents had owned slaves, who on the 26th of July, 1948, signed Executive Order 9981, ordering equality of treatment and opportunity in the armed forces of the United States. He did it against furious opposition in an election year, and he did not blink. Truman's order changed the army Vernon Baker served in, but it could not reach backward and change the paperwork of April 5, 1945. So Baker did the most remarkable thing in this entire story. He stayed. He remained in the United States Army for 23 more years, served with the airborne, trained young soldiers, and retired in 1968 after a career of nearly 3 decades. Then he worked for the Red Cross for another 20 years. A man who had every reason to walk away from his country's uniform, put it on for most of his adult life. Then, in the 1990s, the Army finally went looking. It commissioned an independent study to examine whether racial discrimination had kept black soldiers from the Medal of Honor in the Second World War. The study found what everyone had long known. 10 files were re-examined, 7 awards were upgraded, and on the 13th of January 1997, in the White House, those 7 Medals of Honor were finally presented. 6 were accepted by families because 6 of those men were dead. One recipient was alive to receive his own. He was 77 years old, and his name was Vernon Baker. And this is where his story asks something honest of us. Some people say a medal delivered 52 years late is not justice at all, but a nation's apology to itself, arriving long after it could have changed a single day of the man's life. Others say that getting it right at any distance is exactly what a decent country is supposed to do, and that 7 families finally received the truth in writing. Baker was asked, more than once, whether he was bitter. He said no. He said he had done his job and that he was proud to have served. Which answer is right may say more about us than about him. First Lieutenant Vernon Joseph Baker of Cheyenne, Wyoming, 370th Infantry Regiment, 92nd Infantry Division, born in 1919, orphaned at 4, commissioned in 1943. In 1943, decorated with the Distinguished Service Cross in 1945, and the Medal of Honor in 1997, the only living black veteran of the Second World War to receive it. He told his story in a memoir called Lasting Valor. He died at his home in St. Mary's, Idaho, on the 13th of July 2010 at the age of 90. Here is what remains. Harry Truman could not undo what happened to Vernon Baker's citation, and he almost certainly never knew the man's name. But in 1948, he took the machinery that had produced that injustice and broke it, on purpose, at real political cost, so that the next Vernon Baker would be judged by what he did on the Hill and nothing else. And Vernon Baker, for his part, spent 52 years refusing to let a missing medal define him, and then walked into the White House and accepted it with grace. One man fixed the system, the other outlasted it. If your father, your grandfather, your uncle, anyone in your family served in the 92nd, fought in Italy, or served in any of the segregated units of that war, leave their name and add what they did in the comments below. Don't just leave the name. Tell us one thing about them, one thing they did, one thing they said, one thing you remember. The men who were there deserve more than a name in a database. They deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe if you want the next story.